Mrinalini. That's how you pronounce it, right? Has anyone ever made mistakes pronouncing it?
All the time.
What did they say?
Oh, I've gotten everything. The funniest has probably been Melanie.
Melanie?
Yeah,
Wow.
because I was in North America for a while.
Yeah, they do that.
Yeah.
They used to call me Shivang all the time.
Oh, well, yeah.
They thought it was like a Asian name. But hi everyone, I am Shivang Chandna, founder of Past Modern, here in conversation with Mrinalini. You are an architect by training, a visualizer by heart, and a
Writer by passion.
writer by passion. Wow,
That's what you got out of my bio.
that's how you define yourself. Wonderful.
Yeah.
What does Mrinalini mean?
It means a bunch of lotus,
A bunch of lotus.
or like a bouquet of lotus.
Interesting. What's a visualizer by heart? That's a way you've defined yourself, right? Architect by training,
Yeah.
visualizer by heart, and a writer by passion.
Feel like maybe I should change that now.
No, it's interesting. What is visualizer by heart?
So for me, since my work is in the space of architecture and design, and I write about it, I'm an architect by training. So I've been trained as an architect. I write because I'm passionate about writing, and that's how I express myself.
Mhm.
But in order to do any of that, I need to visualize. And for me, visualizing things is key to anything that I do, right? If I'm talking about the architecture, if I'm talking about my key focus or interest today lies in questioning the norm and the prevalent conditions in order to look at our future histories. And in order to do that, I need to anticipate and imagine and, um, you know, look at what could be the possibilities. So for that is what I call visualization. But also, I'm a very visual person. I need to have the shapes and the colors and the forms in my head.
Very interesting. You talked about future histories. That's a very interesting word. What do you think is the future history?
That's a very wide
Well,
question.
architecturally, where do you think as a country we are headed? What kind of a style will define the next few years for India?
That's a very tricky question. I've been asking this a similar question for many years now that, and you're talking about the future, but I'm talking about more like my question is more about the present. I don't think we really know where we are in the present.
In terms of an architectural style?
Yeah, in terms of what are architects doing, what are we building for, how are we building today? I think there is a little bit of a friction where um, architecture, and I'm talking like in very general and broad terms, right, is struggling a little bit to because we feel that we're tethered to our past, and we're tethered, and our past over here is very often translated to tradition and to the ethnic and to what is conventionally understood as the past. But very often the future is interpreted as what is happening in the West, right? And I think that's where the tension lies, where we haven't been able to really understand what is our future, what is our requirement, and what is contextual to us. Um, so it's difficult to say where we're heading because I also feel that there's so much going on. It's such a large country. There's a little bit happening everywhere. Um, and it's kind of difficult to put under one umbrella term necessarily. But so my question would be, what is contemporary Indian architecture, right? And that can be interpreted in different ways and defined by different people in different ways. But I think we're still kind of struggling to find that identity for ourselves right now.
That's very interesting. I read something about Charles Correa very recently. I think he said, and I might be misquoting, I am not very well read on architecture. He said that I am not very interested in architects who make something just out of the blue. What I like is, or what I feel is much more challenging, is can you build on the past? Can you build on what is already existing and make it more contemporary or make it match the needs of today and tomorrow? So we understand what our past has been. We understand what the needs of tomorrow will be. Why do you think there is a challenge of friction between what the present should be?
Um, I think, I mean, it's really interesting. I was recently in a talk where they were talking about this idea of contemporizing crafts, right? And do we kind of hold on to our past and our crafts, or how do we make sure that our crafts don't die on us? And someone said that the only way that we can take that into the future is if we let it evolve, right? And I agree to a large extent that you have to allow your past to evolve and take you into the future. It can't be frozen in time. Um, I think for me, the key phrase over here is context. And you have to build for a context, right? What was right or relevant or appropriate 30 years ago may not be so today, and is definitely not going to be 30 years from now. So you have to allow your practices to evolve over time as well. Um, I don't I don't know if we really know what we need 30 years or 10 years or even 5 years from now. But I think what is important is to understand that it's an evolving process and to cater to that. But also to anticipate, right? For us, imagining the future and anticipating the future is very key. We can't be stuck in time either. You talk about Charles Correa, and if you see, for I'm just giving an example, his Kanchenjunga building in Bombay,
Yeah.
right, which is iconic, um, was rather sort of path breaking at that time when he built it, I think in the 70s. But what's interesting is that while it was so avant garde, or, so sort of bold of him to do that in the 70s in India, Corbusier was experimenting with similar concepts in France 20 years before him, right? Um, so it's kind of interesting to see how it works. You've got Ashish Ganju, another renowned architect who built Press Enclave, which is this housing society in Delhi. In this was again, I think, in the late 70s, and at that time it was radical thinking, right? Um, People who live there today, or people who look at it or study it today, for them it's a great example of housing architecture in that time, but that's probably not the most relevant today over here. I will be honest, I used to live there. I had an apartment over there. But when I moved in, I made radical changes to the apartment. I'm talking about structure, I'm talking about bringing down walls and breaking walls to open up big windows and all of that. And I actually went to Mr. Ganju and I had access to him. And I told him, I want to make these changes because I don't have light, I don't have ventilation, and all of that. And I had a really interesting conversation with him about this. And, you know, he was okay with me making those changes. I was very apprehensive, going to an author of a building and saying, everything is great, but I want to change it.
Here's my list. These are the
Yeah,
changes I need.
exactly, right. But it was a really interesting exchange with him because he also understands that he understood that there was a need to evolve that, right. What was great and worked for the 70s doesn't necessarily work today, will not necessarily work in the future. So I think like we have to kind of keep running and keep with the times, I guess,
So what
right.
I'm coming to understand is that we don't fully understand what the future will be, which is why it's very hard to define what that architecture might even look like, right?
I mean, like, I'm not an oracle, right? And I don't think any of us can predict the future per se. I think what we can do is be sensitive to our evolving concerns and needs. Um, it's, you know, I'm kind of like picking off from a few questions that you had sent to me earlier. And you talked about housing and this idea of cities growing, high rises in cities, for example, right? And my response to that was that why are we building vertically in cities, right? It's because you've got so many people coming to cities. The influx of population into the cities today is higher than ever before. If I'm not mistaken, by 2025, I think 46% of the Indian population is going to be in cities, right? In urban population. The thing is that it's not about not building vertically in cities, right? Like Delhi, look at Delhi, what's happened to Delhi in the last, you're from here, in the last 20 years. We have the space and the land around us, so we've expanded,
Yeah.
right? Earlier, you could drive half an hour and you'd reach the city outs or like the city limits. Today, you're driving for 3 hours and you're still within the city limits, right? Because we've expanded laterally. Bombay doesn't have that opportunity. So Bombay grows vertically, right? But instead of looking at why cities are becoming denser and growing vertically, what we need to do is look at why are people moving to cities? Why is there this need for cities, right? Or can we decentralize these systems? And we can do that by providing infrastructure and amenities and everything from electricity to sanitation to education um, in other parts, in lesser urban parts, in order to not force people or compel people to come into these urban centers, right? So I think the future is in addressing larger concerns, right? And not only concerns of the urban population. I think the future is looking at a holistic approach to architecture and design and urbanism. And I think what we really need is foresight, and not look at our immediate futures, but look at how do we plan ahead. And I think that is probably something that we might not be the most um, aggressive in, at least in this country.
I think it's also because there's multiple stakeholders in this. Something of that scale where you want to plan cities, you want to plan decentralization of cities across the country would require a lot of public funding, would require a lot of public planning. You'd have to go through multiple authorities. And I think that sort of slows down the process at large. When I look at anyone who makes art, I think it's fairly simple because you take open a canvas and you start throwing paint and expressing your idea as much as you want to. Same applies to fashion. If you want to design a garment, you buy fabric and you begin with it. But with architecture, I always think that you're dependent on many people and systems around you, which sort of makes the challenge much more interesting,
Hmm.
but also much more complicated that it may not actualize in the time frame that you want it to.
Absolutely. Architecture is, I mean, you drew very interesting parallels where art is something that you do as an individual, or mostly, right? Conventional art, let's say. Um, it's an individual practice. It's something that you do by yourself. Architecture is not, right? Even if you're building a really small building, it's not something that you can do on your own, right? It's something that you do in collaboration with people, and it's in collaboration with people, whether it's the client, whether it's your consultants, whatever it may be, right? It's not a one man show. And if you start looking at the city scale, it's definitely not a one man show, right? Like there are various agencies. And yes, it becomes more and more complex the larger the scale is, no doubt.
If architecture was a one person show, as someone who loves to visualize and is an architect by training, what is something you'd like to build?
Ah, that's a tough one. I think there are a couple of things that I've always wanted to build. A house for myself, but that's a small thing. A restaurant. I've always been very intrigued by building a restaurant, a successful restaurant, but I think mostly would be a public building, like an institutional building, maybe in lines of a museum. I think that would be a very challenging project, but also a very gratifying project because you just have to cater to so many things, right? It's something you have to do. You have to take care of a large number of people, a large footfall, a public audience, and so your demographics and the kind of audience is it's a wide range. Um, the architecture, the circulation, all of that. It's like I feel that museums are very complex projects, and I would love to design one day.
There's a new Kiran Nadar museum coming up, right?
Yes.
I haven't seen what the design layout looks like, but I think they put a structure in place as to what it'll be in the coming years.
Yeah.
It looks absolutely fascinating. I haven't, so I love going to museums across the world, but I haven't been to a museum in India, which I find interesting structurally.
Hmm.
I think what I've always found interesting is the art that they have inside, but I've never come across a museum in India that appeals to me as to how it's designed. Have you had the chance to interact with any museum
Mm,
in the country?
in the country. That's a tricky question. It's kind of weird, right? Because I feel like we probably, I mean, I'm generalizing again. Um, we tend to go to museums when we're visiting places
Mhm.
more than in our own space. Having said that, can I think of an interesting museum in India? Probably not.
Have you been to the National Gallery of Modern Art
Over here?
in Delhi?
Yeah.
Have you seen the whole lighting situation going on there?
I haven't been recently, but I feel like in India, museums for me are more memorable by the artifacts and the display
Yeah,
than the building,
absolutely.
right? Like I love the National Museum in Delhi, but
Okay.
it's because I think it's like I'm a big fan of the Harappan civilization, and I've been there a number of times. I've been there to see
You've been
the
to the museum or the Harappan
no,
civilization?
no, to the museum.
Okay.
That would be a dream. Um, I've been to the museum a number of times to see that particular display, and I've been in there also repeatedly to see the Nizam's jewels, right? But again, it's for the artifacts and it's for the story.
Yeah.
However, I do feel that the National Museum has a lot of potential because it's a beautiful building, it's got this beautiful courtyard inside. It just, I feel that that potential hasn't really been tapped. And therefore, the building and the experience of the building is not as memorable as the experience of the artifacts. So it's unfortunate
Yeah.
that
Whereas
that's the case.
globally, I think it's much different because think about Guggenheim, right? People really want to go in
Oh,
there
yeah,
because they love the design of the building,
absolutely.
or a Tate Modern,
Oh, yeah.
very
I love the
unconventional,
Tate
a
Modern.
Louvre.
Yeah.
All these places have a very high appeal in terms of how they're structurally designed.
Yes.
And I don't even think most tourists who go there know every painting that they want to go and see inside. But it's just the place demands so much attention
Yeah.
that it brings in people and gets them interested in the arts, in the culture.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right in saying that. I will make it a point to go to the Tate Modern, whether there's a new exhibition or not, because I just love that space. And I feel the experience of the space is something special. I was recently at the CSMVS in Bombay. And again, I found that it was a really short trip, but it's a beautiful building. It's got such a charm to it, but it just feels drab and it feels kind of like, it pulls you down as opposed to exciting you. And I think that's what's unfortunate. Whereas when you go to the Tate Modern or you go to the Guggenheim, or one of my favorite museums in the world is actually in Berlin, it's the News Museum by David Chipperfield. And I walked around that space. And the reason I remember that is not because of the artifacts or the exhibition I saw. I barely remember the exhibition, but the building is just fascinating, right? Like I could spend hours just in the space without necessarily looking at the display, or the display could come and go and that would still be secondary. But my engagement would be more with the building and with the space. It's an old heritage building which was sort of redone and renovated, and it's just this beautiful amalgamation of the old and the new that it's magical. It's an enigmatic architectural work. Um, but yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of new museums that are coming up in India, which unfortunately I haven't had the chance to visit. But there are architects who are really pushing the limits and are, experimenting and are bringing that about. Now, whether it's in Lucknow studio, Arcom has done a number of projects in UP. There's the Bhau Daji Lad Museum that's coming up. There is the Qutub Shahi Experience Center in Hyderabad by Studio Lotus. So there are lots of different, I believe, and in fact, somebody was telling me 2 days ago that the new museum at Humayun's Tomb, which has been redone recently.
Yeah.
I haven't had the chance to visit
I
it,
haven't been to.
but I believe it is absolutely stunning. And it's at par with a lot of international level museums. So I'm looking forward to going there, just seeing what's happening there.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of like certain buildings or architecture in general is that when they're well done, you sometimes take them for granted.
Hmm.
But when it's not well done, it just changes the experience entirely. What were your early influences? Or what was a building that sort of made you feel that I want to design something, I want to get into this, I want to build something?
Oh, wow. I don't know if I can, pinpoint a single building that compelled me to pursue architecture. Is that like, are you talking about it in terms of why I got into the profession or?
I think just like your initial influence, because I feel everything that we do is sort of informed by our context or where we are placed. For example, I didn't know I wanted to be a fashion designer, but when I saw Daniel Craig wearing a Tom Ford suit and running through any European city and sort of holding that place, being the figure who could just do anything, it almost felt like clothing can make you be anything you want to be. And that was sort of the first influence in my head that that's what fashion is.
Hmm.
So what I'm trying to understand is that as a person who's an architect now, was there any early influence on you that made you feel I would someday want to contribute to this, or wow, there's a power or beauty to architecture?
I think interestingly for me, more than looking at a particular building to see that, this is the kind I'd want to, or this has influenced me enough to pursue a field, for me, it was about spaces and what spaces allow you to feel, right? And there are certain experiences that have stayed with me. Um, some of my early experiences that have really been very powerful that I still remember today is things like going to the Lotus Temple in Delhi. And I remember that space just allowing you to, it kind of takes over you, it takes over your senses. And even as a child, and I interestingly haven't been there in probably 30 years, but I remember the first time that I was there. I remember that even as a child, it compelled me to stop, to pause, and it brought this sort of stillness within me. A similar situation and experience was the Matri Mandir in Pondicherry, in Auroville actually. And I remember going there. The first time I was there was probably when I was in grade 7. We had a school trip, and the Matri Mandir was still under construction, so it wasn't even complete. But we were taken inside to, the sanctorum, and even though we didn't have a lot of time over there, but I just remember that space kind of engulfing me in a sense of calm. And I think these were experiences that made me realize that space has a power, right? And it makes you feel certain things and it compels certain um, emotions or certain qualities. I think for me, my own home was a big influence. My family, my parents have always been very house proud, and the house was always done up in a certain way, and it had influences of various travels and arts and craft and things that had been collected over a period of time. And my own room was always an expression of me, right? It was a storytelling of me and my life. And it continues to be. And I think so for me, it was that. It was the idea of expression through space more than a building. The built form is obviously a part of that, right? But I think it's what architecture evokes in you
Mhm.
is what was most compelling for me.
The reason I admire architecture so much is because I think clothing is sort of an architected fabric that we place ourselves in. It's not so much as to what that space does to us, but what we do to a space when we place ourselves in it. How have your interactions with fashion or clothing been in general? Is that something that you consider when you are expressing yourself, or is it just something that you go by as a norm because everyone has to dress a certain way?
No, I think for me, fashion is an important expression for me, right? And I mean, here we don't more fashion in the conventional sense of the word, that dressing up and presenting yourself, and I think that has been very important for me from the beginning. Um, I was in school and we had uniform, right? And I remember we used to crib about it at that time, saying that why do we have to dress the same and it's boring and this and that. But I really value that today, which it kind of democratized everything, right? Everybody was on the same plane and the same level, and no one questioned who was from where or backgrounds or anything at that point because it wasn't important. Um, I think that also meant that when you were not in school, what you chose to wear became an important expression of yourself,
Yes.
right? Um, and for me, it's always been that I've always been very conscious of how I present myself. I think on a daily basis, I'm a very simple, jeans, t-shirt kind of person. But when the occasion arises, I do choose very sort of, I make conscious decisions of how I want to present myself, what I want to wear. And I tend to be, um, you said, do I just wear what everyone wears? I don't usually. I'm not somebody who follows trends. I like to do things. I have a very eclectic sort of, or I've been told, fashion sense. I love my traditional Indian clothes. I am the most comfortable in a sari. So if it's an occasion, that's what I tend to go towards. Um, you know, I'm I tend to gravitate towards color when it's traditional Indian wear, and I tend to be a little more sober and you know darker or uh, like blues, grays, blacks, and whites when it's Western wear. But yeah, that's just who I am. I think for me, fashion isn't, it's an expression of myself, but it's also an expression of what I'm feeling at that time, right? I heard something recently, and people say, or someone said that you should dress to no, wait, let me get this right. Instead of dressing to express what you're feeling, no, that's not right either. I'm sure. I hope you can cut all of this
Yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah.
But basically, I think the point was that wear what you want to feel as opposed to wear what you're feeling,
Okay.
right? And I thought that was really fascinating
That is
because,
interesting.
yeah, I tend to do the latter. I tend to wear what I feel. Um, but I think it is a powerful tool to change that. And if you dress how you want to feel, I think there's a lot of merit in that.
I think I've done both in my life. I've dressed how I feel and how I want to feel.
Yeah,
There are days when you just feel really low. Maybe it's the weather, maybe it's the life that you're living, and you can just add something very bright on your outfit, and it just lightens up the entire day.
yeah,
Um, I read recently about Zaha Hadid. She's a big fan of, or she was a big fan of avant-garde fashion.
yeah,
So she talked about this point when she was at Harvard, and because she was one of those female architects, and there weren't many female architects around then, she would always stand out from the crowd. But then she would also dress in a Issey Miyake or a Comme des Garçons, which are very, very avant-garde and not the normal-looking clothing that we are accustomed to, and that sort of alienated her furthermore. So I think fashion is a powerful tool, but it just really depends on how you use it and what purpose it helps you achieve.
absolutely. I don't know if it alienated her or not. I think she stood out, right? And she stood out for various reasons, not just her fashion choices. But I think it's interesting. I was recently having a conversation about this, about how people choose fashion to stand out, even though it's not necessarily an expression of who they are,
Mhm.
right? And that's also become a big controversy today, in terms of, but it's a personal choice. You do what you want to do. Someone would call somebody eclectic, somebody else would call the same person a mimic. I think it's an expression, and I think it's a choice whether you want to be true to yourself or what you're doing it for. But it's very personal,
Yeah,
right? And it's um, I'm the sort of person who would I tend to be understated, but then I'll have like this one accent piece, right? Like I'm wearing this beautiful dress by you, but I feel like I put this on to that's my sort of that's how I personalize it.
it's also a very past modern look because that jewelry is much more antique, whereas the dress seems very modern. So it's very on brand.
Thank you.
Um, but to go back to your point, a friend of mine has this quote that, "How do I stand out when a crowd forms everywhere I stand?" So I think some people are like rebels with a cause, some people are rebels without a cause,
Absolutely.
and fashion or how you want to express yourself is inherently stems from who you are and who you want to be. But circling back to our conversation about architecture and the future of it, um, what we've come to understand is that we can't really learn as much about the future. But what do you think we can hold on from the past? As a country, we've seen many pasts. On a timeline, we've had a pre Mughal era, a Mughal era, a British era, a post independence era. So, what do you think in those time periods are lessons or architectural wonders that we can draw from as influences?
I think we touched upon this earlier that we have to allow ourselves to evolve with time. Um, I do feel, I don't know if there, I don't know if it would be fair to say that, we should draw on any particular era to look into the future. I think what we should reflect on is, excuse me, what we should reflect on is things that have been successful for us, that have been sensitive to our contexts, right? Sustainability is a big word nowadays. But what does that mean? What does that translate into? Um, just because we built in brick and lime plaster in the past doesn't mean that that's what we have to do in the future. But we have to learn from why we did it, how we did it, what was it addressing, what are the concerns that it addressed, how can we innovate, right? I think for us today, we've been so profligate with ourselves in a short history that it's not enough to just put a break on things and to start to kind of repair things. We have to go beyond that. um,
Bless you.
I think what is important for us is I think innovation is very important for us. And we can reflect on the past to learn on various aspects to improve it, and more than improve, to contextualize it for the present and for the future, right? I think for me, in context is key, right? What is the context within which you are building? Whether it's your cities, whether it's your independent buildings, whether it's fashion, wherever you are, there's a time and place for everything. And I think that is of utmost importance, right? Reflect on what has happened and what has been happening and what has been done to see how it can be improvised on, how it can be innovated upon to like take it forward, right? Allow it to evolve. I think that is key for me. Um, Again, like I said, whether it's in architecture or urban planning or even fashion for that matter, right? For me, context can be it can be material, it can be your geographical settings, it can be socio-cultural aspects. Since I've moved back, yes, I've been mostly in Delhi, but now I split my time between Delhi and Bombay.
Do you prefer one?
Uh, no, I think Delhi is home for me. Born, brought up here, so it's home for me. Bombay is growing on me.
Okay. You recently moved to Bombay?
I haven't moved. I spend a lot of time over there. I
Okay.
kind of like split my time between the two cities. But I started to appreciate Bombay a lot more now than I ever have before.
What city do you think is better designed, Bombay or Delhi?
Oh God. Um, Bombay's a mess.
Okay.
I think there's no other way of saying it. I think in terms of like the city and the urbanity of it, Bombay is just it's crazy, but because it's just so dense and so compact, and um, it's kind of sprouting in different bits and parts. Delhi has definitely had the advantage of space,
Hmm.
and we are blessed to have that. And I think that's why we feel the chaos a little less in Delhi, is just because things are a little further apart and there's a little more breathing room. But I think Delhi is equally messy, or is becoming so.
I think when people talk about like Bombay traffic or Delhi traffic, for me, I've been to Bombay as well. I always find like both cities have equivalent amount of traffic.
Now, yes.
I don't think there's a huge difference.
No, Delhi's just become terrible where traffic is concerned now. It never used to be like that, right? And
I Ever since I've been on the road, there's been traffic.
yeah, I remember like when we were younger, we used to talk about, oh, it's going to take you traffic or going to places was never about time. It was about kilometers in Delhi, right? Like, oh, this is about 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers away. And you would understand that that's approximately how much time it's going to take. Now it's become about time. And what used to be, what we would assume would take us 15 minutes easily is double the amount of time today, right? If not more. Um, I think, yeah, Delhi's just become is starting to match other cities like Bombay, Bangalore, where traffic is concerned, which is really unfortunate.
Have you heard about the Boring Company by Elon Musk? The idea of like traffic solutions where you can sort of dig down, try and like run through what are these like corridors so that you can be from one place to another.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there any effective solutions to traffic in growing cities architecturally?
Uh, it's an interesting point because I've been talking a lot about um, Mumbai. When I was doing my master's, Bombay was a big part of my research. And I've written papers about the new Mumbai Coastal Road. And so the reason that they've built this coastal road that, spans the length of the city is to alleviate traffic woes, right? But the question has also been that how many people is it really catering to? What's the percentage of the population that is actually using the coastal road? Who does it really benefit? And what are the repercussions, right? Um, there are multiple statistics to this, but there are also it's a big discussion, right? We talk about infrastructural projects like this have um, that affect the city at multiple levels. So while of course you kind of so in Bombay, what's happened is that now you've got the coastal road. You can go from, let's say, Nariman Point to or Marine Drive to Worli in 8 minutes, right? Which would take you about 40 minutes earlier if you're on the coastal road. However, what that has done is also you've eaten into 100 meters of the coastline
Yeah.
in order to build this, right? What are the ecological repercussions of it? What happens because what you've now done is having this road that runs within the water. You've you've isolated the city from the sea. This Bombay is no more a water facing city. Now it's a road or highway facing city, right? Um, but then there are talks about developing that entire stretch and having a green patch and a green lung for the city that is not there. That is yet to be developed. Now we'll see what happens when that happens. So it's a big controversy. And there are multiple aspects to it. I would be doing a disservice to oversimplify it by saying whether it's good or bad or whether it works or doesn't work. It definitely works for a lot of people. Um, I've been in a way arguing against it because I feel that there are a lot of socio-economical, ecological um, repercussions to the city through the coastal road. But the coastal roads also made me a hypocrite because I use it when I'm in Bombay and I'm grateful because I'm not stuck in traffic anymore, right? A lot of people will argue that because there's the coastal road and the traffic has bifurcated and diverted onto the coastal road, the city is less congested. Again, I think it's too new to say how effective it's going to be. But yeah, there are a lot of cities in the world that have gone through this process and have, after many years and decades, decided to break down these large infrastructure projects and go back to being more pedestrian or being more sort of, you know, friendly, let's say people friendly. And my question would be is that are we learning from these cities or are we just waiting to make our own mistakes? Another question would be that instead of spending so many thousands of crores in developing this infrastructure, could we have taken that money and actually developed public transport,
Yeah.
right, to cater to a larger number of people? Um, and again, these are questions that will unfortunately remain questions, right? You see this in Delhi, we've got the Delhi Metro, which is a highly efficient system and has changed the way people navigate across the city. Um, but that hasn't necessarily meant that the number of cars on the roads have reduced or the traffic has
That's
become better.
that's my next question, and I also want you to add in the point of which you mentioned before because we didn't get it on the recording about the best building being the one that isn't made. Um, when we try and think of solutions, why is it always addition and never subtraction? Why do we think that if you want to cure traffic, let's build a metro line? Why don't we think about limiting the number of cars a household can buy or putting high tariffs like countries like Singapore have done? What are your thoughts on this?
That's tricky, right? Because we're a growing economy, right? Um, everybody wants, like every household today has at least two cars, right? That wasn't the case when I was growing up, let's say, right? It's, I mean, your middle class is burgeoning. You're getting more people coming into the city, the influx of the population coming into urban centers. Um, I think it's also easier to build than to edit, right? That's how we think. We were talking about this earlier where we said that I don't know if like what I've said till now really addresses your concern, but let me rephrase that, right? Um, it's it's a very good point that you bring up in terms of why are solutions more additive than subtractive, right? Um, if we have a housing shortage, we look at providing more housing, building more housing. If we have too many cars on the street, we think of making new roads, right? I think um, it's, I don't know if I have an answer to this necessarily, but yes, we would, architects and designers and urban planners have been talking about this forever, saying that what is the root cause of the problem, right? Why don't we address that? Um, if it's a matter of navigating and transporting people across the city, why are we not building more infrastructure and public transport? Why are we not bettering our bus system or our railway system or our metro system, right? As opposed to bringing more roads. And that's the classic argument that I've been sort of voicing for Mumbai and the coastal road in Mumbai. um, we talked about, in architecture, there's this saying that the best building, or something to the effect that the ideal building or the best building is one that already exists or one that hasn't been built or is not going to be built, will never be built, right? There's so much already. How do we use what we already have? And I think that is becoming a big question today, is how do we this whole thing of reduce, reuse, recycle is not just about consumables, but it's about our environment, right? Adaptive reuse of buildings. How do we take old buildings and make them viable for use today and in the future, right? And if we are going to build, how do we build long lasting buildings that have a longer lifespan, right? um, it's a matter of, again, looking at what is the core problem and how do you find solutions to that. I think, I mean, in fashion, isn't there a rule that before you step out of the house you take one thing off, right? Like, how do you edit
I think that
for,
was Coco Chanel that take an accessory or something
yeah,
off.
yeah. And I think, yeah, we're not necessarily looking at things in that way, right? And I wish we would. And we talked about this whole decentralization of our urban centers earlier, but it's not easy to do, right? It's easier to perhaps cater to, like, you have something that's running, you've got something that's working. How do you kind of expand on that than to take something that doesn't work and fix that, right? I think isn't
Yeah.
it's a little bit of a vicious cycle, right? And then we get stuck in that. Yeah, unfortunately, there's no clear answer that we have to this.
Educate me about the ecological impact of using concrete because I remember reading recently that we've as a country we've sort of become like a very we use concrete everywhere as a because it was a more popularized western idea, but it isn't the most sustainable approach to building. Is that true?
um, it's concrete is not the most sustainable building material in the conventional sense. That is true. It has a lot of, it's got a very high embodied energy. It's very hard or close to impossible to recycle. But there is a school of thought, and it's interesting. A very close colleague who builds a lot in concrete is actually has previously argued this, that if you build in concrete, but you have to build in the right way, right? I mean, you can't be irresponsible in your building, irrespective of the material that you use.
Yeah.
Um, if you make buildings that are long lasting and that are robust, then you are tackling certain issues. It's like saying fast fashion versus investing in, you know, in pieces that will last you a long time.
That will last you a lifetime. Yeah.
Right, right. Now, I'll kind of flip this around and say that, okay, we were talking earlier about buying a linen shirt that with every wash will fade a little bit and will have a shorter lifespan, right? Versus a polyester t-shirt, which will have a longer lifespan by that logic. What is more sustainable?
I think sustainability is always used to keep brands or companies in check, but I always feel that it's a two-way street. Consumers need to walk the mile also
Yeah.
and meet us somewhere in the middle. So you might want to have the most sustainable material, but are you okay with it fading with every wash? Are you okay with how it looks every time that you put it through a washing process? Are you okay with it aging, or do you want a crisp cotton t-shirt or a crisp shirt every time that you want to wear it?
Yeah.
So I think sustainability is a very, I mean, where we are as a country, as a planet, ecologically, has been the results of all of our actions.
Absolutely.
So why blame or hold only a certain people or certain sect accountable?
Oh,
Everyone has to do their bit.
oh, absolutely. I mean, you talked about how fashion is such a huge contributor to a negative ecological imprint, right?
Yeah.
Um, architecture and the building industry is probably, if I'm not mistaken, the most or the highest contributor to a negative impact. But that's my question, right? Is that what is more sustainable? To buy a shirt that I'm only going to wear for, let's say, hypothetically 1 year, but it is manufactured in a more sustainable way, or to buy a shirt that I can wear for 5 years, but is not manufactured in the most sustainable way, but it lasts me 5 times longer.
True, but I think what should be important is that what happens to that garment in the entire lifespan of the garment, not in the
And
lifespan
post
of,
it.
yes, not in the lifespan of when you wear it.
Yeah.
So once you discard a polyester t-shirt, what is it going to be to the environment? Is it going to be a added impact, a negative impact, or a positive impact could be a cotton shirt that is a biodegradable fabric?
Right.
Or even when it comes to cotton, the amount of water a cotton plant consumes is much, much higher than some other fabric options. So I think altogether it's a big matrix that doesn't give you one solution.
That's the same with architecture. And I think over here, this is where it brings me back to innovation, right? The key over here is that how do we innovate to change challenges into benefits, right? Um, Today, there are people who are experimenting with material and have been able to develop material like or concrete like material, but from plant based products, right? Um, and there's this thing about green concrete that's come up now. It's not at a point where you can replace your commercially available concrete to build structures, but I think these kind of challenges are also paving way for innovations, and I think answers lie there.
Yeah.
Right, answers lie in how do we start addressing these problems through innovative ways? How do we improvise with what we've got? And how do we continue our practices in order to not? I think we've gone, and I mentioned this earlier, we've gone past the point of now sort of restraining the problem, but now we have to look at how do we proactively address the concern, right? So we need to see what are ways that we can do that, and innovation in everything, in material, in building technology, in design, in you know city planning, all of that innovation in that thinking things through, finding solutions to the core problem is the only way out of it or around it, I would say.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. We talked a lot about aesthetics and also art in general. Are there any Indian creatives, designers, architects that you admire?
Oh, lots. There are so many people. I feel that India is going through this very inspiring time right now where there is just so much happening in architecture, in design, in art. There are so many young artists who are really kind of, blossoming in different ways. I'm not the best person for names, but I appreciate, for me, art is something, like I said, right? For architecture is something, if I walk into a space and it kind of evokes a certain emotion, that's what calls me to it. For me, art is if I see something and it speaks to me, that's what works for me. I'm not somebody who will necessarily go behind certain names. But I just think that India right now is going through this massive, massive time of, we're kind of like, we're inundated with creativity and there's so much going on, that it's just, you, every corner you turn, there's something new and it's fascinating. Whether it's different material or different media, people are experimenting with form, with colors, with all sorts of things. I was at Art Mumbai recently,
Yeah.
and I was just blown by some of the works that I saw. I've been looking at, I mean, this is the time, right? And there's so many gallery openings and so many art shows that are coming up. And it's amazing to see what people are doing. Similarly, in the design space, it's amazing to see the kind of work that people are doing. They're taking traditional craft forms and contemporizing them to make products, right? Whether it's cane or it's fabric, it's weaving. In fashion, you're taking like traditional weaving material and techniques and creating contemporary fabrics, or sort of reimagining silhouettes and things like that. So for me, it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, that's what we aim to do as a brand because I think that our past has a lot of value, but everything, like you said, has to be put in context of the present. So I don't think a consumer my age or people who travel a lot, people who do a lot of things that are much more global, in the present time cares to wear a kurta every day, but they still want to carry their heritage or their culture in some manner. So, how can we reimagine the silhouettes? How can we reimagine the form to sort of cater to that need, to fulfill that aspiration? And that's what we want to do with Past Modern too, is that can we weave in our culture, but also make it very modern for the present day or future context?
I think that's really interesting. And, you say people of your age. I would say someone of my age. I think for me, or just personally, I love mixing things up, right? I will wear a sari with a shirt, if I need to, or I will wear a kurta with pants. And
Oh,
I think what we're at a time where it allows you to do this. It allows you to kind of, fashion allows you to express yourself in different ways, like we were talking about earlier. You, I'm wearing this dress by you, which is a very contemporary silhouette, very classical in a certain way. But for me, like bringing in a piece of jewelry like this, it's not the, oh, if I'm wearing something Western, I have to wear something contemporary, right? Like you can kind of mix and match. And that's just me, also my personal style. But I like to do stuff like that. Like I will wear, um, I don't know, jeans and a top, and I'll wear like a jamdani overthrow or something. And I think that's what's also happening in general around the country, right? Where we are able to experiment with the past and the contemporary. I don't know about modern. I feel modern is kind of like it's an interesting word, but it means so many different things.
so does contemporary.
Yeah. But like how you can just make things your own,
Yeah,
right? I mean, the space that we are sitting in currently, you've got, it's a mixture of textures and colors and styles. And for me, that's me. It's an eclectic aesthetic.
yeah.
And that's what I thrive on. It's more about storytelling. It's more about, um, you know, personal narratives that start to emerge and appear.
I think when I talk about fashion, I talk more about like utility or everyday form. So when you look at a movie from Satyajit Ray from back in the 60s or the 70s, you'd see every man wearing a dhoti. And if you look at a movie now, you'll see every guy wearing jeans or a trouser. And I think we've replaced those silhouettes just because of how utilitarian a
Yeah,
certain garment is.
comfort and convenience. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's our modern day demands that make us dress a certain manner too.
absolutely.
But I think we can still wear a pair of trousers that could be Indian, that could carry our past
Yeah,
heritage, that could carry our craftsmanship, but still be applicable in the world that we live.
absolutely. It's like, you can wear sneakers with a kurta and pants today, but you could also wear sneakers that are made in India, by an Indian brand
Yeah.
using certain indigenous techniques. They don't have to be a Western brand for that matter. I love wearing juttis, right? And I wear juttis with everything, whether it's a sari, a suit, a dress. I'm wearing a pair right now. Um, I feel like we don't have to pigeonhole ourselves, right, into certain ideas or concepts. And for me, that's what's exciting about fashion. And that's what's exciting about today, right? Where you're seeing people really kind of mix things up.
They're questioning the norms.
Yeah.
They really just understand who they are and now they want to understand why are they being confined to certain boxes.
Yeah. And it's a time of experimentation. And why not? Right? Everything is a why not, which is fun because it allows you to explore and expose yourself to different ideas and things. Want an image, right? They've seen images and they like those images and they want those images to be theirs, right? So they will go and say, oh, I want my house to be like this, or I like this person's aesthetic and style, so please make my house like this. Um,
Which is why you think houses are houses and not homes
and
anymore.
not homes anymore because these houses are now being made by other people, right? And again, this is a very personal sort of take on it because for me, homes are where you tell your own personal stories, right? But if you've got somebody else to come and curate everything in your house, right from your rug to the table to, your cutlery and crockery and this little lamp on your sideboard, what is yours, right? How is it your home? It's like living in a hotel then. It's like you kind of, walk in with your suitcases and your clothes and then that's it, right? And I think for me, homes are personal. Homes are stories that you tell about yourself and your families and your travels. It's like fashion, right? If fashion is an expression of your individual self, so is a home. But like I said, that's my personal sort of take on things. So if you come into my home, every piece in that house will have a story to tell. Like, oh, I traveled here and I picked this up, or I went to that exhibition, I bought this, or somebody gave this to me, or, this belonged to my grandmother or father or whoever else. And I feel like that's changing and it's becoming lesser and lesser personal, which I find is a little, um, I feel like I miss that. I miss that in people's homes now, right? Because like when you walk into a space, you want to know people's stories.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that's fading away because, like you said, we have so much information. We're taking images that as we like or as other people like, and we just want to fit it into our living somehow. Whereas it shouldn't be that way. We should be able to sort of make our own images, know what we really like. Um, if anyone wants to learn more about Indian architecture or Indian architects, what are some architects you recommend knowing about?
Oh, that's a tough one.
This could be from the past or at present.
I mean, see, I think it because architecture is a really large field, right? It really depends on what your interests are. Um, of course, I mean, we've got such a huge, um, we're sitting on treasures and treasures of built heritage in the country, right? Like, if you look at Delhi itself, you've got the Humayun's tomb, you've got the Red Fort, you've got Safdarjung tomb, you've got Lodi Garden, and there's just so much architecture from that era. If you look at the mid-century and you look at the LIC building or the Statesman's House or even Connaught Place in general, right? Like
Yeah,
all of central Lutyens Delhi, which has its own charm. If you look at something more recent, 70s, 80s, Some of my favorite housing projects in Delhi are Crescent Lake by Ashish Ganju, or the Asian Games Village, the 1984 Asiad Village by Raj Rival is just, it's mind blowing the way that the whole space has been planned, right? Um,
He also designed the Pragati Maidan, right?
uh,
Raj Rewal.
Raj Rival, Mahendra Raj, yeah,
And now they've
parts
changed.
of
And
it.
now they've changed the
Yes,
entire thing.
yes. Um, if you look at contemporary architecture, there's a lot that's happening in Delhi. Um, somebody that I know very closely is Virendra Vaklu, and we spoke about concrete architecture, and he's actually building a lot in concrete, and he has made these very sculptural forms. Um, Unfortunately, they're all private residences, so access is difficult to them. But like I said, there's just so much happening in Delhi. There's institutional work. There is interior work. Look at some of our museums. The Craft Museum is a beautiful piece of old architecture that has been sort of revitalized in a certain way. Um, I think the Central Vista project in itself is a case study. Um, I'll kind of reserve my commentary on that a little bit, but I think there's a lot of very interesting things that are happening in the city. Delhi in itself is a very interesting urban or not settlement, but an urban sort of project. Um, the nostalgia that India Gate still invokes in people across generations, and from my parents and grandparents to me to you to even younger generations. It's this huge public space for Delhi. I think the city has that much to offer for us. So it really depends. It's like saying, if you're looking at it in fashion, right? Would you look at traditional weaves? Would you look at artists and artisans and fashion designers? And it's so diverse, right? Some right from a Banarsi weaver to a Gaurav Gupta. I mean, that's an entire spectrum of fashion right there.
Absolutely. And that same applies to architecture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One last question I have for you is that I often read this quote that architecture is frozen music. What does that really mean?
That could mean so many things. Well, I don't know if I really agree that architecture is frozen music. I think architecture is very alive. I don't think it is frozen in time at all. I think architecture can be very musical, can be very rhythmic, but that is if you're in that space. And I think that's what architecture is. It's an experience. It's something that you have to experience for yourself. You have to be able to walk around the space and allow it to, um, you know, evoke certain emotions and experiences
You
in
surrender
you.
yourself to it, right?
Sure. Or you don't. But in not surrendering yourself is also a response to the architecture, right?
Absolutely.
So architecture is is a provocation in a certain way for me. It provokes thought and it provokes certain responses. So I feel that it's not necessarily frozen in time. Like frozen music is, I feel, is photography, right? It's a moment, it's an image, it's static. Architecture can't be that. I was literally having a conversation with a couple of friends recently where we were talking about architecture and photography, and that's, for me, that's the difference. Where photography is a moment, architecture is an experience over a period of time, because you have to experience that space, you have to spend time in that space.
You live with it. You engage with it much more actively.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much.
Likewise. No, thank you for this.
But I had a great time.
No, likewise. It is great to know about you. What It's interesting to see what people are doing and how they're following their own paths.
Do you read a lot about James Turrell?
Oh, I love his work.
I thought so because you talked a lot about like architecture, sort of like holding you still and letting that moment sink in. I think that's what he does with his spaces or installations.
Have you actually experienced some of his
I've
work?
been to the one in LA, I've been to one in UK, and I've been to one in.
Which one in the UK?
There's one that is in a national park. It's a 3 hour train ride from London.
Okay.
Because he does shows, but then
Yeah.
he also has some like
These permanent, yeah.
the one in UK was okay. It was very small,
Hmm.
but I really liked the one in LA.
Which one did you go to?
I should have images.
Was it in a building, in a museum,
I
or
think it was the LACMA. They had something going
okay.
on with him.
He's fascinating. I've worked very closely in as a lighting designer and also in just lighting and architecture.
Hmm.
And he is
Oh yeah, this one.
he's a
It's at the
genius.
Pomona Museum.
Yep,
He
he's
is.
just a genius.
I bought his book recently, the one with the pink cover. Have you read it?
I don't think so.
So beautiful book. You can borrow it if you want to.
Sure.
It begins its scratch from his early days up until now, Rodent Crater. And I didn't know so much about like Quakerism or what that school of thought really is, but that's a person you can see is he's taken his early influences and really weaved in something that is so seems so dramatically different, but also you can make that connection.
I think for me, what's fascinating is how he um he can kind of he introduces the idea of not experiencing space. It's like it's this
Because you can't see the proportions or
you
the
can't, right? Like he kind of suspends you in a vacuum, in a spatial vacuum. And that is fascinating because he allows you to really shed everything that you think you know to then again introduce new ideas to you. And the way he does it so simply is just, it's amazing.
it seems simple in terms of when you see it as an experience, but when you see what goes
It's
on behind the scenes,
hugely complex.
yeah, the
Yeah.
way they're studying angles or
Yeah.
with the rodent crater, like how do you place a certain
Yeah.
cove or an opening, it's extremely fascinating. What I really like about him is that he he's very self-aware. Um, like he talks about how painting or art has always been the study of light,
Hmm.
and he says, me being very American, of course, I took the most mainstream approach of doing it in a very contemporary way and saying, why not just use light as the art piece altogether,
Yeah.
which I think is funny but also apt in its own way.
Yeah. Yeah. His work is incredible, undoubtedly. I was at the Chichu Museum in Japan and I saw some of his works and actually a number of his works over there.
Is this the one which is on a separate island,
Yes.
which is designed by Tadao Ando,
Yes, part of it, yeah.
and
The museum is by Ando, yes,
they
and
have a
then
Yayoi Kusama, the pumpkin.
so they have changing exhibits over there. When I was there, it was like a holy trinity for me because in the Chichu Museum, designed by Ando, they had a James Turrell
And a Monet.
installation, and they had the Monet,
Yeah, the lilies, I
the
think.
lilies, and that's the largest works in the world, if I'm not mistaken.
Japan May, there's an island where I think they have. Tadao Ando was the one who sort of came up with the idea.
He designed a number of buildings over there, and the
Okay.
Chichu Museum was his. But I think that island has been there like since forever.
And the
It's
idea was that bring architecture, art.
yeah, and there are people living over there, but it's only pedestrian. They have one bus that goes around the island, or you can have cycles, but no cars, nothing. And then there's a ferry to the mainland. Um, it's unbelievable. Like there are people who have their own houses over there, but otherwise, like all your big buildings are museums and institutional works. And like I said, the Chichu Museum was a holy trinity for me because you had Ando designed the museum,
Yeah.
which was just spectacular. Um, and you had James Turrell's installation, and he's been like, huge in my mind. And then you had Monet and his lilies, he's one, for me, he's one of my greatest
Really? I don't care
artists
much
there.
about him.
Yeah.
I think he's okay.
I love his work. I think they're just, for me, his lilies are highly, highly immersive.
I think the reason I don't value him enough is because I see him as like a artist who was very, very acclaimed in that time, but wasn't questioning enough. Um, for example, Manet, on the other hand, I
Mm-hmm.
think was someone, or Gustave Courbet, were like people who were really radical and asking questions
Sure.
and weren't valued as much, or maybe even Cezanne.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Monet was like oh, this is beautiful on the surface. Everyone loved it. Everyone bought it, which is why maybe I don't see him in
So it's interesting,
high
right? Because
appreciation.
one is the works in isolation, and then it's the works with the context that they come from
Can
and
you
emerge
separate those
from.
two things?
Um, for me, with art, I feel that I do. Like, so when I look at a Monet, and we spoke about this earlier, when I look at artists or art today, I'm looking at the art for what it is, right? And for me, the story, so it's like separating the art from the artist, right? But the story is secondary. Um, but once you know the story, it's difficult to then draw the distinction.
Okay, so I can never. By the way, हम ये record कर रहे हैं नहीं? I can never distinguish art and artist. If I find an art piece that I really enjoy, I need to know everything about that person because I'm just so fascinated. And then I think the more information I have, the more I can value or cherish that artwork. For example, Picasso, right? Like he's gone through so many phases,
Sure.
and I find all of them very fascinating. But then when you learn about him being an absolute maniac, being so self obsessed, or I read a book by his ex wife, which sort of painted him as a big I don't know how to phrase it, but he didn't think of women in the best manner.
Sure.
And you can then sort of see his pieces and realize he's really objectifying women in different ways because of how he's drawing them. And that's a very different perspective which you wouldn't get if you didn't have that
Absolutely.
information.
Absolutely. No doubt. I think again, it's a matter of convenience, right? Like you said, so when you look at it academically, there's a lot of you're kind of peeling back layers of, why certain things are done in a certain way. And if you don't, then you just look at the art for what the art is. And I find it a little tricky because for me, a lot of especially like young artists or a lot of art that I see, I want to see it for what it is. I'm not saying it's the best thing to do at all, but I think for me it's also about it first has to speak to me before I'm even intrigued by what the story is behind it.
But for example, have you seen the Mona Lisa in person?
Yes,
What does that speak to you if you don't know who Da Vinci is?
I think unfortunately the Mona Lisa, like the Taj Mahal, is so spoken about that it has become overrated.
Hmm.
So when I saw the Mona Lisa, it didn't affect me at all.
Sure.
The same with the Taj Mahal. Whereas when I walked into Fatehpur Sikri, I was floored and I was in awe of that space
So
and the craft
having
and
less
everything.
information about something can really alter the experience.
It's just, yeah, because you're overly exposed to it.
You have no preconceived notions.
Sure.
You're
Yeah.
going in with a very open mind.
Yeah.
I agree, but I feel that most people, when they look at a Mona Lisa, they think, oh, very beautiful just because it's known to be.
Because it's
But
supposed to be.
exactly.
Yeah.
But unless you really know Da Vinci as a person or what he was trying to achieve mathematically as an engineer, you understand it took a lot to paint it the way it is
Yeah.
painted.
Yeah.
And the beauty doesn't lie in the painting itself, but in what led to it becoming.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why I said it's not easy. It's a tricky situation, right? Like, do you separate art from artist? I don't know.
But yeah, the island is a holy trinity for me as well. I just haven't had the chance to be there, but it's something that I really want
You
to.
must. If you go to Japan, you
I
must.
haven't been to Japan too, so
Yeah.
that's the idea.
It's a little like out of the way,
Mhm.
right? Like you have to travel by train for a couple of hours and then take a ferry, which is another 45 minutes or something like that. But I think, you would really enjoy it.
I also love Ando,
Oh, yeah.
self-taught architect, right?
Is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't even know how that begins or how you approach that.
There are a lot of architects who are not actually trained in the profession.
How
You'd
do
be
you go about
surprised.
designing a building when you don't know anything about it? It's just so it baffles me.
Yeah.
But I think he was at the Pantheon in Rome, Ando, and that's when he felt that this speaks to me so much. I need to create something.
That's the whole thing about light and space, and that is reflective in his work. You can see that. Like the Pantheon itself it's a phenomenal space. It's a phenomenal building. And the way it's been designed, the way it's been constructed, and the sensitivity to every last detail. So yeah, it's, and the experience, like if you spend over however much time you spend in the Pantheon, your experience of that space evolves with every minute, just because of the state of the nature of the light in that space.
I completely agree. I think I've also felt the same way about like paintings, cinema. You can go back to a piece of music or a piece of art or a piece of literature,
Hmm.
and every time it's a fresh perspective. Maybe not so much about how it's made, but how you individually evolve as a person.
How you perceive it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that totally changes the experience every time you engage with it.
absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. This has been extremely insightful and one of the most fun conversations I've had about architecture, art, and living in general.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure having you here and talking about all these things. It's been very insightful for me as well, but a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.